lecture for today. All right, welcome back. We are game 3001. That's Artificial Intelligence for Games in the winter 2022 semester at George Brown. And it's week 13, part 1 of our lecture lab series. Lab 7 isn't up. Okay, I'll make sure that it is, Lucas. So this week we're talking about utility theory, and just because Lucas informed me that lab 7 isn't up somehow, 1 second, and we'll make sure that it is before we start going on this one. So last week we were talking about goal-oriented behavior. We also discussed very briefly rule-based systems and how that is very different and a little bit older than some of the newer stuff that we've been talking about over the last little while. So that's something that we talked about. We also, in Lab 7, Part 2, we asked you guys to put together a close combat enemy as well as a ranged combat enemy. And Alex had, he was kind enough to put together some examples, kind of Star Trek examples that were kind of cool. 10-4. When is this close? So I'm just taking a look at these. Okay, I see what's happened. Let's see what's happening. So we are 4/9. Friday is the 8th. So the 10th would be the right day. Okay, that should be available to look at now, Lucas. Okay. So Lab 7, we did close combat enemy. We also did the range combat enemy. We used a series of additional, we restructured our decision tree, so the decision tree brain, right? So that's what we did. I'll put that in there too. We restructured the decision tree brain, like a brain or AI brain, to be, kind of part of the AI agent. That's what we kind of did, right? And that's how we were able to add different agents: close combat enemy and range combat enemy. And again, this is in trying to get you closer to your assignment 4, which is the next thing that's up. So what is going on this week? This week we're talking about utility theory as well as action execution, which is something that we've been talking about. We've been talking about actions for a long time, but really haven't defined what types of actions there are and what you can do with actions. So we'll talk about a little bit of action execution at the end. Stuff that's due. Lab 7, Part 1, 2, and 3 is due this Sunday at midnight. It should be open for you now so you can see it. Assignment 4 is due week 14. That's next Sunday at midnight. That's not very far away at all. So again, there's a lot of stuff you can do for assignment 4 to get ready. Things like animations and a bunch of other things that you can get done ahead of time, so you don't have to wait for us to do it in a lab. Although we'll talk about some stuff that we're doing this week in lab to help you. Again, we're sitting at week 13, and next week we're going into tactical and strategic AI, things like waypoint tactics, tactical pathfinding, coordinated action, and a bunch of other stuff to help you with tactics. So how do you make your AI smarter, and how can your AI agents work together to really challenge the player? There'll be a new lab, again, Lab 8, that'll be out next week. And then the last week, again, is your Lab 5, or the lab presentations, where you'll be doing your assignment 4 presentations. Assignment 5 details will be out next week in terms of what you're expected to put together for your PowerPoint and as a backdrop, as well as how do you present and what we're asking you to do. Okay, so that's coming out very soon. So that is kind of administration of what's up and coming and where we are today. Let's move on to the topic of today, which is utility theory. So the things we've been talking about actually so far this second half of semester is decision making. How do I make decisions? And one of the things that we've been talking about last week was, well, we have some goals and goal-oriented behavior. We had we had some things that we talked about. We discussed things like, um, we're kind of not happy, discontentment. How do we move an AI from being unhappy to a happy state, right? And we talked about different ways of doing that, where they have several goals to meet, and one goal can kind of clobber the needs of another goal. And how do we kind of mix that in so that way, an agent can be, happy. One of the things that we talk about, we're just going to backtrack a little bit, and we did discuss very briefly the idea of utility theory, very, very briefly last week, and we're going to expand upon that this week. So again, what's my motivation for an AI, as an example? And so again, why does an NPC do the things that they do? Okay, why does a boss do the things that they do? Why is the boss there in the world anyway? A lot of it is because of context, story, and narrative. But one of the things that we can use is something called utility theory, and we'll talk about what that is as well. It's a way of scoring decisions, and it can be quite interesting the way it's done. So really, we have a set of available decisions, and we score them using some kind of mathematical formula, and the agent selects some kind of course of action from among the best scoring options. And then the general concept of utility-based AI is that every possible action is scored, and only the top scoring actions, one of the top scoring actions is chosen. And I'm not saying the only one, because sometimes always selecting the best action isn't really something that is right for us to code, because then it becomes deterministic. Simon's asking a question: are we able to create decision trees with more than just a left and a right? Can we have like 3 or 4? Okay, but then it's not a binary decision tree anymore. Can you? Yes. Would you? I'm not sure that I would. I might make different decision trees, but yes, you could totally different. Totally do it. The great thing about making a balanced decision tree or balanced binary tree is that it's very, very fast, because you have a set, kind of a fixed set of conditions. But you certainly could, you can make your decision tree look like whatever you want, to be honest, right? But making it with 3 or 4 sub decisions to make, you may want to think about refactoring that tree to think about what decisions depend or conditions kind of lead into other ones. Okay, because sometimes, we might want to think about making like a tree that has 3 or 4 different things that can happen at the same time. But a lot of times those actions have triggers that are very similar. So take a look at that, Simon. I would kind of examine your idea. Before we get into it, we've been talking about all the way till today, and there's one more topic that we're going to cover, which is kind of machine learning and learning in general. We haven't covered that yet, but we're going to be talking about classes of agents a little bit today, and so far we've been dealing with simple reflex agents, kind of like the action reaction, and if then. So if this happens, then do that. That's an action reaction, or a very simple reflective agent, reflex. There's model-based reflex agents, and those are things like they respond to the world. They kind of have a model that they work with, and then they kind of create a model for the entire game state of the world. Okay, model-based agents. Goal-based agents we talked about last week, which were kind of like, hey, I have a goal, a motivation. As an example, I have an itch that I got to scratch, kind of thing. And you know what? I got to get that itch scratched, and so that gives me my discontentment. I have a discontentment score for all these different things I want to do as an agent, and I need to satisfy my motivations by making sure that I lower my discontentment. That's what we talked about last week. And then there's utility-based agents, and I kind of included this little diagram for this one only. But really what we have is some kind of perception or sensing suite that senses the world, the environment, the game world. The game world kind of feeds its information to its sensors. And we have some kind of a game state, what the world is like now, and what my actions will do. If I do some action, it'll change the world. What will it be like if I do action A? How the world will change if I do action A? And then utility gets kicked in there and says, how happy will I be if in such a state? If I do action A, how happy am I going to be as an agent? And then what action should I do now based on the idea of utility, and then I have some actuators, things that enable me to move, things that enable me to do animations and all that kind of stuff, and the actuators kind of influence the environment, and there's this feedback loop that kind of happens with the utility agent. Learning agents, if you notice, kind of the 5 classes of AI agents, with each class being more capable and intelligent than the next. The one we're going to talk about near the end of the semester is something called learning agents that give you the ability to learn from your environment. And so we've been talking about things like different kinds of AI, strong AI and weak AI from the very beginning, supervised learning and unsupervised learning. We're going to be talking about that over the next couple of weeks. But for today, we're talking about utility-based agents, where how happy am I going to be in such a state? Going back to that idea of utility and how that kind of feeds into something like your goals and motivations. So really, it's been around. This utility theory is not new for games. It's been around for a while. It's been around for not just for games, but also the idea that it's, I'm in economics. I want to buy something, and I want to know what the greatest, how much I can buy with the money that I have, as an example. So the idea behind it is that every possible action or state within a given model can be described with a single uniform value, some kind of value that you can assign to your actions. Okay, actually, you can try it for yourself too. If you have a set of actions that you can perform, and if you score your actions based on the priorities you have, and also the thing that's going to make you the happiest, a lot of times, if you actually were to do that and write it down, kind of write down the things that you did, every action you took, or every action you chose not to take, based on those motivations and goals, it's quite interesting and introspective. It can be kind of an introspective exercise. So again, the value that we're talking about, this uniform value that you can assign to every action or inaction, is usually referred to as utility. That's what we talked about last week very briefly, and it describes the usefulness of that action within a given context. In this case, our given context is the game world, the game state, if you will. Okay, so that is the given context. Let's suppose, as an example, here's an example to get you guys warmed up. You go online and you need a new toy for your cat, as an example, and you want to find the perfect one. One website has the toy that you want to buy for $4.99, while another one sells the exact same toy for $2.99. Well, you know what? Assuming the delivery times are the same and all things being equal, you're probably going to choose the toy for $2.99 because guess what? It's cheaper than the other one, or less expensive. And so that option typically has a higher utility than the toy for $4.99 because in the end you are left with more money. More money means a higher utility for you, higher happiness. More money means you can do more things with your money, right? David says, or whichever has the best Amazon reviews. There's another one. But that again, that you're going to choose that based on what you think is going to make you the happiest, what is going to be the highest quality. And so those decisions that you're, almost like more information to make a better decision that's going to be finally, you think when you buy something online that it's going to be good, but sometimes you get something and it's not quite exactly what you wanted. And so, that's where the reviews are there for. So again, this process gets a little bit more difficult. So we did a very simple thing. Yeah, you get a toy and you get 2 different prices. Well, okay, I'm going to pick the one with the lowest price. No problem. But what about when I compare the value of 2 things that aren't really directly comparable? An example of this, let's say we have the same idea, but we have 2 different websites that give 2 different delivery times now. Okay, so the toy for $4.99 will arrive at your house in 2 days. So you have Amazon Prime or whatever, it's going to arrive in 2 days. Somehow it's going to happen nowadays. And while the toy for $2.99 will arrive in 5 days, it's not Prime, okay, on Amazon as an example, and it's from kind of a smaller provider, a smaller seller, and it's going to arrive in 5 days. And in this case, the choice is no longer a simple matter of comparing the 2 price values, right? There's got to be some conversion between time and money, and it has to be made in order to measure the overall worth of an action. And we could say that each day is, let's say, worth $1, right? Which means that the total cost of the $4.99 toy is actually $6.99. Well, the total cost of the $2.99 toy, because it takes, example 5 days, we said, you add 5 to $2.99, so it's $7.99, which means that the $4.99 toy is the winner in this case because it costs you less combined money and time, where time is equal to some value of money. Okay, so that's kind of an idea of both things, two different things, kind of adding together to have a different utility. So again, it's important to note that utility is not the same thing as value. Utility is what makes you happy. Value is the measurable quantity, like such as the prices, and times. And utility measures how much we desire something. All right. So, and this can change based on personality or the context of the situation or all kinds of other factors. Okay. So how much you desire something. That's really how we measure utility. Okay. In some ways. So example, let's say, for example, if we were a billionaire, we had lots of money, and you would likely choose the cat toy for $4.99 because you might value time more than money. And then the $2 you save is negligible, right? As an example. On the other hand, if you're not so rich, you would likely choose the cheaper toy and wait the extra time because that extra $2 is really important to you because you need it, right? So that money has the exact same value, right? So the value, the measurable quantity, right, is the same, but the utility of the money is variable based on the context which it is being considered. So money for a billionaire, that's, kind of those quantities, it's negligible, like we say, for someone who's got a lot of it, right? But for someone who needs it, they can wait, right? Which makes sense. So one thing to note is when we're talking about algorithms here, we're talking about making an algorithm. So it's important for us when we're calculating utility scores to be consistent in the way we put them together. And a lot of times because we're comparing, two different actions, two different values, as an example, to come up with a final decision, we kind of got to put everything on the same scale, right? So a lot of times we've been talking about numbers throughout the semester. And we're going to talk about numbers again in September when you guys come back for physics. And a lot of times we have a normalized value, some kind of score between 0 and 1, when 0 is 0% and 1 is 100%, right? And so a lot of times we want to start there. We want to kind of think about, if I was going to put, the utility score on this, we want to kind of map it to the same scale, even though the money might be different. We want to kind of map it to the same scale so we can start making a comparison, apples to apples, as opposed to apples to oranges. You can't compare things that are on different scales, right? It's very difficult. So that's one thing we have to do. So again, they also combine very easily. So if I have a normalized score from 0 to 1, I can combine it very easily and I can have an average, right? And also that any value range will work. Doesn't really matter, even if it's not 0 to 1, but as long as it's consistent. That's the most important part, right? So let's suppose an agent scores an action with a value of 15. We need to know that means that in the context of the whole system, that 15 means maybe 15%, 50, or is it 15 out of 25? What does it mean, right? When I score a value of 15. So the numbers have to make sense when we're starting to score utility. All right, because we want to compare, and just as if we're doing a decision, we're on a decision tree, as an example, right now for the stuff we're doing in lab. There is no, multiple decisions that we can make that are equal. For example, let's suppose I have, and just before we move on, I have multiple decisions to do when I have line of sight. Let's suppose I have an agent that's not just a close combat agent, but also can do range combat. Okay, so I have both capabilities, range combat and close combat. All right, but I have line of sight. So what is it I'm going to do? It really depends on the goal of the agent and its conditions, its states. Let's say if the agent has taken some health damage, right, and going close to the player, if the player only has close combat capabilities, then you know what? Using a ranged weapon might be the right way to do it. Or if the player is just like the AI and can do both, as an example, and you've taken a little bit of damage, but, you think that that you evaluate that the best thing, a course of action to do, because there's a greater utility, and maybe the thing that makes the non-player character happiest, let's say that kind of non-player character, is health. They might decide to, again, duck behind cover and use ranged attacks. But what if they really love, one of their desires is to get in close because it makes them happy to do close combat. Maybe they're better at it. They have a higher skill level. Even though they have some damage, they're just better at doing that. So the chances are they're going to choose, if you're playing in a non-deterministic way, to go and do close combat, right? So multiple things that you can do. You're going to score those two actions based on the overall utility, not just one set of components. A lot of different things in the context of that particular AI. So really, the key to decision making using utility-based AI, which is also what it's called, is to calculate a utility score, sometimes called a weight, right, for every action the AI agent can take, and then choose the action with the highest score. Of course, like we said, most games are non-deterministic, so calculating the exact utility is not usually possible or even desired. We don't want to always do that every single time, because again, if you know that, well, if I'm hurt, that the agent's going to come after me, well, then you can set it up so you can fool the agent, because the agent's going to come after you, and you can keep your score low and then drink a health potion just before they get there and then beat them up, right? There's lots of ways to fool agents if you know how they're going to respond, as an example. So so the heart of the utility is trying to figure out what the best action is, but it's hard to know what that is without doing some kind of scoring. So the most common technique for to figure out what utility, the kind of calculating the utility score, is to multiply the utility by some kind of probability of each possible outcome, and some of these weighted scores together. So things like, it'll give you, and I'm sorry for the math, but this is how it looks like, something called expected utility of the action, because you don't know what the outcome of the action is going to necessarily be, right? Even if you do take that action, you go and charge in and try and do a melee attack, you don't know if you're going to actually land a hit or not. So this can be expressed mathematically, and we can say that expected utility is the sum of all actions, right? That that based on the desire, that's the desire for the outcome, and multiply that by the probability that that outcome will occur, right? So that you get some kind of expected utility based on those two things, all right? So which is kind of neat. And really, this probability is normalized, again, from 0 to 1, so that the sum of all probabilities is 1. So you kind of sit down and kind of look at all different kinds of actions, sum of all actions. And what we want to do is we want to add up all different kinds of actions and say, what's the probability that that expected utility is going to happen based on this action, okay? And so what that means is, let's say, again, going back to that idea, the expected utility of me going in close combat, if I had, let's say, a brute kind of warrior, and he loved to fight in close combat. Notice the words loved and desired. He likes to fight in close combat. It's not because necessarily it's the best course of action, but it's what he desires, right, to us, that the AI would like to do. So he'll go and fight in close combat. Maybe he's the best at that. Maybe it's because, he likes to get in close. That's what he likes to do, right? So the probability that he's going to win, there's a number that's associated with it. Let's say, for example, he thinks that the probability, the expected utility of fighting in close combat is going to bring the character down is about 70%, right? Well, what about the other 30%? That other 30% is if, what about, I have to kind of talk about, what if I'm at a ranged, stay at a ranged combat, the expected utility at a, from a distance, and the outcome that would not just satisfy me bringing down the player as an AI agent, but also satisfy the goal of being in close, because that's what they like to do, would only be 30%. So you add those two things up, 0.3 and 0.7 on a 0 to 1 scale, and it becomes a 1. And that's what this is saying. You add up all the normalized probabilities until they add up to 1. Very simple. So again, this is applied to every possible action that can be chosen, and the action with the highest expected utility is chosen. And this is called the principle of maximum expected utility. So again, it doesn't matter if you're playing a game or doing an economic, kind of some kind of bartering simulation, it's the same thing, okay? Expected utility is based on desire multiplied by probability. So, okay, so we've tried to calculate utility given a set of outcomes, but really the next step is taking an arbitrary game value and converting it to some kind of utility score. So we need to do that too. So calculating the initial utility for a decision factor is, well, really subjective, right? Because it really depends on how you feel. What is more important? A good example of this is, let's suppose you're making a tabletop role playing game, and you want to try and calculate what a potential NPC is going to do. Am I going to strike the player on the left? There's two players in front of me, right? And I've got an NPC or some kind of monster that's going to fight the players, right? It has 3 attacks, two claws and a bite. Okay, here's an example. And I can, I can do 2 claws and a bite on one character. I can do 2 claws on one character and bite the other one. Okay. So how do you kind of score that if you're going to use some kind of decision making? Do you say, well, the GM, the game manager, is going to be doing something like this? They're going to say something like, okay, I'm going to roll 1d6, 1, 2, 3. The monster is going to strike you with its 2 claws, or 4, 5, 6 is going to strike the other guy, right? Okay, so you roll the dice, 1, 2, 3. Okay, the monster is going to hit you with its 2 claws this round. Okay, and then again, 1, 2, 3, it's going to bite you as well. 4, 5, 6 is going to, bite your friend, right? Which one is it going to do? Roll the dice. Okay, 4, 5, 6. It's going to do 2 claws on you, and it's going to bite your friend. How did you come up with those numbers as a game manager? Sometimes also called a game master or dungeon master. How do you come up with those things? Sometimes it's arbitrary. It's kind of like, depending on who's looking at this thing, they could judge it differently. For example, if you went into the room and this is the last monster that's standing, and your character has personally killed all of its friends, right? Maybe the GM might say something like this. Guess what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to attack you. 6, it'll attack him, because there's a high chance that it's going to attack you because, you really decimated everybody. You killed everybody in the room, as an example. So those kinds of decisions are the things that you have to make, not just as a game master in a tabletop role-playing game, but also as an AI programmer. You got to figure out, okay, so how do I come up with these probabilities? It's kind of subjective. So we can use this, so we can talk about, putting this idea on a linear curve. Okay, so that's what we can do. So a linear curve, it forms a straight line with a constant slope. That's what it is. And the utility value is simply a multiplier of the input. So the following equation shows the formula for calculating a normalized utility score for a given value. So if I have a utility, I have x over m, where x is the input value and m is the maximum value for the input. All right. So again, if you think about that, the maximum value, if I was going to try and figure out, a normalized value for a color channel, let's say if a color channel was RGB, and I was calculating from 0 to 255 levels of input for that particular channel, right? And if I gave you a value of something like, let's say, 223. So if I wanted to find the total utility, let's say, for example, if I was going to go higher values, closer to all on, have a higher utility than values that are all off, let's say, as an example, then I could calculate that as, let's bring up our little calculator. And suppose I said that, I could say 223 is my level of achievement for that particular color over the total number of colors, right? Or color values, which are 255. Right, you can see that number is 0.87, and that will be the utility for that particular example, right? So again, you take the total number, or where you are right now, over the total maximum value that you can get for that particular input. So again, this is just another normalized function, which is all we need for linear output. So here's some examples. So Heart of Thorns AI, again, for Guild Wars 2, which some people are still playing out there as well, is modeled over on something called the Infinite Access Utility System, right? And one thing that they talk about, and I've kind of put together some links for you guys for this topic, because this topic is pretty deep in terms of how you do utility specifically for games. So I've kind of got Guild Wars 2 here if you want to take a look at that. I think Guild Wars 2 by itself now at this point, if you're interested in it, is I think it's free to play, the basic game itself. So if you look at our games, and if you look at something like Guild Wars 2, they have, here's Heart of Thorns, right, where you can learn more about Heart of Thorns and what it is about. And so, what these guys are from the GDC Vault 2015. They talked about how to, and here's the video for that. I've kind of linked it here inside of the on Blackboard there. So a couple of one guy, Dave Mark, which he talked about this intrinsic algorithm that he put together for building a better centaur in Guild Wars, as an example. And he talked about how to do it. And some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about here, it comes right from his talk, right? So it comes right from Guild Wars and how they kind of use utility theory to kind of build a better decision maker. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that they kind of put together. So take a look at that if you're interested. And that's why Guild Wars 2 is kind of like a little bit of a case study on how to do good utility AI. Okay, so let's talk about that just a little bit in that context. So really, from an architecture perspective, let's think about this. AI characters are allotted a certain selection of decisions. All right, well, let's talk about actions which the AI can take at a various point in time. And different archetypes or species, in this case for them, of character may have very different sets of available decisions. In our case, we only have two species of characters, a ranged combat enemy and a close combat enemy. Okay, just to bring it back to what we're doing, right? And each possible action for a given AI agent is mapped to something called a decision score evaluator. Actually, this is going back to machine learning now, which we'll talk about later on, or a DSC. So during a think cycle, each DSE, decision score evaluator, for an agent is scored, and the best scoring option determines the action that the AI takes for that think cycle. And a think cycle could be each frame, but I don't recommend that, or it could be a certain amount of frames, some kind of time frame, outside of just a single frame, a single tick, if you will, because kind of making a decision every tick. We talked about this before. It can make for a very schizophrenic AI, right, or an AI that's very jittery, right, which is really bad, right? So you want to kind of make that decision take a little longer, not just one frame, but several frames. And that might be this think cycle that we're talking about here. So the scoring of a decision score evaluator, right, consists of accumulating all the scores of the considerations assigned to the DSC. So here's something. Each consideration, this is something that the AI might want to do, is essentially a raw numeric input normalized to the interval of 0 to 1. And this is what they were talking about on the GDC Vault, if you want to take a look at that. That score is processed through some kind of response curve, whether it's a linear curve or whatever it's going to be, which remaps the original number to a final score and again is normalized. So again, the reason why we'd want to use some kind of response curve is because it really depends on the context, right? So you don't want to make it linear necessarily, because sometimes it makes it so it's very deterministic. And so you want to sometimes use some kind of curve so that it could be even just diminishing returns. So, in other words, the AI will most likely pick something kind of in that sweet spot on the curve as opposed to where, and let's suppose the curve is, there's different kinds of curves that we can define, right? So let's suppose if we were to map it according to a curve, and just as an example, let's say, for example, this is the graph, right? The curve might be something like, it might look like this, right? Where I kind of come to here and go down. That might be the curve, right? And that kind of means like over time, if this is time over here and this is the utility, then the utility is going to drop over time. That's what it might mean, right? So you want to do it as early as possible. So the later I do something, as an example, will have a lower utility than if I did it right now. Let's say, for example, for a particular action. Okay, so that might be something we can do. But at the same time, you might have a curve that looks like this, that kind of does this. And what happens is there's a point in the curve that things just peter out, right? Where there's diminishing returns, or even the returns stop at a specific point in the curve, which means, let's say the enemy agent will only do something until about this point. And after that point, I mean, it's all the same. So there might be a better action to do after a certain point of time. So that's why the response curves are really important. When we map a set of possible actions to a response curve, it makes it more interesting. Okay. And that's what they were talking about on the GDC Vault. All right, so again, take a look. I think it's a good little video to watch. I always find that Vault videos are really interesting, and they kind of come with a lot of experience from people in the industry that have been making AI for many years and have faced different kinds of problems, and they've solved different problems with different things, mathematical formulas, as well as different coding concepts that they've used or coding structures. Okay, so again, these scores multiplied together to obtain an overall score for the decision score evaluator itself. That's one thing we want to do. And then now let's suppose a DSC has two considerations. So remember when I say consideration is there's two possible actions or two things that the agent really cares about. When we say considerations, we want to think about considerations almost like motivations. Remember we talked about last week, motivations and goals. We kind of were using the same term, motivation or goal. Here, we're just going to say motivations. And we're going to convert this motivation to something else. We're going to call them considerations. So two different considerations. Distance to the target and health of the target. Those are the two considerations that we're going to have to satisfy our motivation. There we go. Ooh. Health can be a simple fraction. So how many maximum hit points, right? As an example. So let's say, for example, the target has normally 55 hit points, but now they're down to 12. There's a ratio of, current health versus maximum health. That'll give you a number between 0 and 1. Nice, right? And then distance can be normalized by providing bookends. So for example, when they talk about that in the video, a distance of 100 meters might be maximum and 0 meters might be minimum. So if they're right in front of you, that's 0, and you want to get away from the person. Let's say 100 meters is maximum. So even if you go beyond that, remember that curve that I just drew? It doesn't matter. It's the same value, whether you're 100 meters or 1,000 meters. Once you get outside of the range, effective range of a player as an AI, maybe that's the right thing. Okay, so that again gives you a number between 0 and 1, where anything beyond 100 meters is still 1. Doesn't matter. It's like if I want to turn up the values of from 0 to 1 for a color value, and I clock in 1,000. Doesn't matter if I put 1,000, it's still maximum is 1. So you can't get higher than 1, right? Which is kind of interesting. So then now we can start comparing health and distance because we have some kind of current hit points over maximum hit points and wherever my distance is. And then I can start thinking about how I can compare these two. I have these two considerations to make, and I want to score them. I want to use a decision score evaluator to kind of figure out, which consideration is the right one to choose based on, the highest utility. So the next step is to process these raw numbers via the response curves. We talked about this. We would map them out to the response curve. We can also weigh them. Sometimes the response curves are also a weighting for these two same things. Even though we got a number from 0 to 1, we're going to weigh them, and it's going to give us another value. And in this case, imagine that the closer targets are more appealing than distant ones, okay, as an example. So given a target of 25 meters, the raw consideration score would be 25 over 100, which would be 0.25. Okay, so that's the consideration score. And then we pass through some kind of suitable function, as an example. However, 25 meters, might score as, say, 0.95 because you're putting it across a curve and saying that, well, you know what, when we remap the score, we're remapping it from to kind of produce a relative importance for that particular consideration. Again, it sounds complicated, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to map two different options, things to consider based on our utility, to try and find the highest utility for a particular action set, if you will. Okay. So again, one thing to note is that response curves, and numbers, all those things end up being something like this. We're converting decisions to numbers, guys, which means everything is data-driven. And you know what that means to us? When something is data-driven and I can assign a value to it, I can make a decision based on values that are higher, values that are lower, which is really what machine learning does when it comes to predicting and to find the best possible outcome. It's really interesting. So any consideration can disqualify an entire decision, one thing to note, from being selected simply by scoring 0. Okay, so that's something that also can be there as well. So some considerations, as an example, it doesn't make any sense, right, to go further if we try and do so. Again, as soon as the consideration drops the decision score to 0, right, then the system stops processing further considerations and early outs, which means we stop doing that thing. We don't even look at that thing anymore because it's 0. We're not going to look at that anymore. Moving on to the next decision. Okay, so if remember, a consideration, it's almost like a reason for doing that decision. I want to make a decision. I have a bunch of things to consider, right? I want to create a DSC, a score, or some kind of utility score for that particular decision. But maybe when I map the utility to some kind of response curve, the distance, my health, other kinds of factors that we put together, it becomes 0 or very close to 0. Then we just don't even look at that anymore. It's become something that we don't want to do. Okay, so a considerable portion of combat-related work that went into Heart of Thorns was focused on moment-to-moment tactical positioning and maneuvering of individual NPCs. So that's what they're going to talk about if you watch the video. Many characters have an archetypal style or flavor that they represent, and then the choices driving the movement of those characters on the battlefield have a substantial impact on how well the designer's intent is actually conveyed during gameplay, right? However, there are also common and widely used sorts of movement, the type of things that basically every reasonable, intelligent character is expected to do during a fight. And a perfect example of such a common movement is evade dangerous areas. So let's suppose that is your motivation. Evade dangerous areas. If the AI character is too close to such a danger zone, and they'll rapidly exit, and often playing a specific dodge animation, momentarily avoiding any incoming attacks. Avoid dangerous areas. That might be a motivation, which is kind of interesting, right? So here's some considerations for evade dangerous areas. We want to prevent the action from being chosen in the middle of another action, okay? We want to detect nearby dangerous activities and locales. We want to know if avoiding dangerous areas, if I'm in the process of fighting, that I don't want to go there by accident, okay? We want to stop choosing this decision after a certain number of repetitions because guess what? It's deterministic, right? If we always try and avoid dangerous areas, then I can steer a character into a place by creating a dangerous situation, dropping bombs, throwing grenades, whatever. That could be considered a dangerous area for the player if I do a lot of that stuff, so I can steer the autonomous character where I want them to go. The health value of the autonomous character is also something that we want to think about, and the higher the score, the lower the need to evade dangerous areas. So if I've got full health, then maybe the utility of avoiding dangerous areas or evading dangerous areas may not be that high, as an example. Evade dangerous areas. So here's another one, close to melee when invisible, right? So much like its evade dangerous areas counterpart, close to melee when invisible is a decision score evaluator that attempts to move a character into a more advantageous position on the battlefield, right? However, it's much less widely applicable. Only a few characters can be invisible at all, right? And not all of them want to get closer to their enemies when they're hidden from view, right? So a good example of close to melee when invisible might be, or let's just not even say invisible, let's say while in stealth, while hidden, whatever you want to call it, is I want to do a stealth attack, right? And maybe if I have the ability to do a stealth attack, this might be a consideration, right? Okay. So here's some considerations when it comes to this particular line of action. So prevent decision from activating on immobilized or otherwise occupied characters. So I'm not going to put this, this close to melee when invisible action or a desire into effect if I'm currently fighting, right? It doesn't make any sense. Oh, well, I'm going to get close to melee. I'm not invisible yet. I don't want to turn invisible. If the character is still invisible, right? Is the character still invisible? Am I invisible or not? Have I been detected? If I've been detected, then I can't really use this action, right? And move close to the target if the autonomous character can reach the target before turning visible. So what if I only have a limited duration for my invisibility? Or let's suppose I'm doing some kind of stealth attack. I'm an autonomous character, And you know what? I'm going to go from an area that's dark to an area that's light. I may not make it to the, um, to the target, before I become visible again. I become detectable, right? How about the other one? Is my health value as an autonomous character too low to risk this kind of action? These are all things we have to consider. So these are all things that we bundle together to create a more of a complex action sequence, a more of a complex kind of decision. Because you know what? There's a lot of things to consider, lots and lots of things. Okay. All right. Any questions about utility? So utility is great, and I brought it up because I want you guys to think about different ways of scoring your actions. So right now we've asked you to do things very, very simply, right? But it doesn't mean that you couldn't assign a value. Again, expected utility would mean the desire that I want to do something multiplied by the probability that it's going to happen, right? As an example. How do I calculate that probability? Well, we could program it in. We can say that, if you're this close, then the probability is going to be higher. We want to choose that probability that you're going to, the enemy is going to choose that, that action based on how far they are away. If they're a close combat enemy, right? If they're farther away, as an example, maybe they'll choose some other action to take. Maybe they'll choose, the ability for them. Maybe the close combat enemy can also, in another scenario, hide. Imagine that. So you have a bunch of obstacles that we laid out. We haven't given you this as a challenge, but imagine if your close combat enemy can kind of get out of sight. If they go behind an obstacle, they can stay in stealth, and unless you directly look in that direction as a player, you can't see them, right? They're kind of in stealth mode. Or unless you shine a light, if you have some kind of light capability or something else like that, they stay in stealth. That could be a whole game mechanic, if you will, right? And it could be the same game mechanic that we've seen for some players in some stealth-like games, right? So again, it's really interesting the type of decisions that your enemy or your AI can make based on different considerations. So any questions about utility theory? Again, utility theory is take a lot of different things into account, and then you come up with a number, really, at the end of the day. Let's talk about action execution. So far we've been talking about actions throughout the decision-making process. We've been talking about things like, okay, I want to take this action. I want to take this action, right? As an example, everything from decision trees to rule-based systems, they all generate actions, right? We have a bunch of considerations here in utility. We've talked about, a sensing suite, where we have a couple things we've asked you to do for your assignment 4 is we want to give your enemy AI both line of sight and some kind of radius detection. We want to be able to use radius, some kind of detection radius to detect if the player is around. And if they've detected the player, that means they've heard the player, and they're going to try to get to a place where they can see the player. They're going to hunt for the player, right? That's the idea with the detection radius, right? So those are the two senses that they use. And it's going to be, again, depending on the agent that we're going to create, we're going to do some kind of action reaction, worst case scenario, a reflexive type of agent, a reflex agent, right? And a very primitive one at that too. We haven't loaded up your requirements to give your autonomous agents these two agents goals. We even said, as an example, that your close combat enemy also has some goals. They also want to keep healthy, and they're going to. Sure, we said that they're going to run away if they have low health. That's kind of an alarm condition. We talked about that, but we didn't say that they also want to gather resources. That's some kind of side goal, and that's why they're here. That's the context. It's not just an arena, because that's what we've kind of asked you to make. We've asked you to make kind of an arena where your character, until they get spotted, is in the middle, and your job is to try and fight off the agents as long as possible. And the larger number of agents that you can fight off and kill, as an example, it gives you more points. And the winning condition in our A4 is if you can kill both agents before one of them runs away. Okay, that's the winning condition. But we haven't really made you do, a lot of complicated. We haven't given them a lot of desires. It's really just the only desire they have, the only utility they have is killing the player. That's what we've given them. All right. So very, very simple agents, very primitive reflexive agents that we've given you to make, right? But throughout the entire time, we've always said that there's some kind of decisions that they're going to make. And then finally, at the end, whether you're using a decision tree, a behavior tree, or a state machine, you're going to make an action for the agent, some kind of action that's going to happen. So again, it's going to call a function. It's going to tweak some state variable. It's going to ask a different bit of game, AI physics, rendering, whatever to kick in and to perform some kind of tasks. That's what that is going to happen when we perform an action. So there's different types of actions. Let's talk about them. There's state change actions. That's one type. Some kind of animations. We've given you those. We've given you animations to play as an example. Some kind of movement in terms of steering behaviors. We talked about steering behaviors earlier on this semester. Or other AI requests. You know, for example, maybe I want to make some other kind of decision or a sub-decision. And there might be some interface commands. Let's talk about all those different kinds of actions. So again, state change actions, they're the simplest kind of action. And a lot of times it's not directly visible to the player. So they're going to make an internal state change. You know, a good example of that is if the autonomous character changes the firing mode of its weapon from, you know, kind of a spray to, you know, to a sniper, if they have that kind of the ability for them to do that, right? You know, that's something that they might do internally, but you might not see that change, right? Or, for example, they want to use one of its health packs. You may not see the health pack being used unless we actually attach an animation to them using the health pack, right? So again, a lot of times these changes have an associated animation or some kind of visual feedback when the player carries them out. But when it comes to the enemy, sometimes we don't have those kinds of feedback that are associated with them. So they just involve some kind of change in a variable. A variable changes internally, and now they've healed. Or now, you know, as an example, maybe they heal over time. You know, you fight an enemy that continuously regenerates. So if you don't kill them quick enough, within about 3 minutes of combat, they heal a quarter of their health, and every 3 minutes they heal another quarter of their health, or something like that. Or the longer the combat goes, there's more and more helpers that they get to fight you. So the sooner you kill them, the better it is. You know, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's one type of action is state change actions, where something happens internally that you may or may not see. Most likely you won't see them. Another one, animations. A very primitive kind of visual feedback. Again, we see some kind of animation happening. It might be a particle effect, fire, when a character casts a spell, or a quick shuffle of the hands to indicate the weapon reload. And often combat is a simple matter of animation, whether it be the recoil from a gun, so you see the gun recoiling, sheltering behind a raised shield, or a lengthy combo sword attack, right? It's some kind of animations that you're going to see. Animations could be more spectacular. We could do some kind of cutscene if we really wanted to, or whatever. But for the most part, it's just going to show you some kind of movement internally for that particular agent. So that's another type of action that they can take, right? So, and we've talked about the difference between locomotion, which is movement, moving around an object, using your transform to move an object from one location to the other, changing the rotation of the object so that they look in a particular direction. That's locomotion, right? We're moving the actual object, the game object around. And the animation is internal to that particular game object. So if I'm changing from one frame to the next frame, frame-based animation, or in a 3D scenario where I'm actually, using my armature, my bones, to manipulate or affect the mesh, 3D mesh, that I might use frame-based animation to change the bone position and the depending on how close they are to, let's say those bones are to a particular a joint or a part of the body. That joint is going to deform. It's going to move along with the bone. And that kind of animation is another type that we might see as well. If we're going to do it in 3D, sometimes even in 2D, they have 2D animation with armatures as well. So actions may also require the character to make some kind of movement. That's the third type, right? Where through the game level. So again, locomotion, like we said, decision-making algorithm could tell the autonomous character to run for cover, as an example, or to collect nearby power-up. In our case, we're asking you to go behind cover. That is one of the actions or movement action that we've given you. We can also pass on the movement to a physics system if it's physics-based as well. All right, so that's kind of another action. Another one might be AI requests. So you might have, remember we talked about hierarchical state machines. We talked about combining decision trees, at a high level with the state machine internally, those kind of things. Almost like a high level decision-making algorithm and a lower level decision-making algorithm, right? So AI requests might do that. They might make a request from one system to the other, from one decision tree to a state machine or something like that. And examples of that would be something like the AI controlling one team in a real-time strategy game, may decide that it's time to build. So it activates the build action, right? But deciding which building to build, as an example, in some kind of strategy game, you're going to pass off the decision to make that building to another system. It's not going to be made by the same system to say, what is my current action? Build, gather resources, attack the player. Those are the higher level actions. The lower level actions are, okay, what kind of attack am I going to make? What kind of building am I going to build? What kind of resources am I hunting for? Those are different lower level actions, and that's a handoff between one AI system to another, right? That's AI requests. And then finally, interface commands. Okay, so things like, I want to play a sound effect. I want to show you a dialogue snippet. I want to schedule a particle system or some kind of other effect, like a decal, a bullet decal, that kind of, when I fire off, you see a divot on, on a building when I fire a bullet to kind of indicate that the bullets hit the building, right? Anything like that might be something else. It's an interface. I want to kind of show something to the character, right? Give an update to the progress bar or anything like that. That is interface commands. So let's talk about first what is a single action, and we'll talk about a single action versus a compound action, different kinds of actions. So I can kind of combine it into one of these flavors. In fact, most actions have at least two of these components to them, two things that we talked about earlier, whether it's some kind of, when it comes to flavors, maybe I have an animation and a movement, right? That could be something that I have. Or maybe I have some kind of AI request that I make alongside with an animation, So I have two of those flavors that I'm using at the same time. So here's an example. Reloading a weapon involves both the state change, replenishing ammo. You can't see that where the enemy's replenishing ammo. Maybe you'll hear something like a some kind of sound effect, a primitive sound effect that's being played, right? Again, that's an interface change, right? And the animation, the hand shuffle, to show you that they're, to doing that. But really, the reloading of weapon can take multiple little AI actions that are in the background. Running for cover, it might involve things like an AI request to the pathfinding algorithm. So I'm passing off my request from where I am now to do, okay, go do pathfinding. It could be a function. Go run this function, as an example. And then movement, do some path following. Or some animation, wave the hands over the head in panic, whatever it's going to be. Deciding to build something may involve more AI, right? So choose what to build. And animation, the construction yard's chimney starts smoking, or whatever it's going to be, right? So it's really kind of a combination of at least two of the components most of the time. So actions involving any animation or movement, they take time to execute, right? It doesn't happen immediately. And but state changes, like things like I just got health, or I reloaded my weapon, or whatever. It could be immediate, could be right away, right, for it to happen. And an AI request, can be pretty much honored right away as well. If I want to hand off my with the next job to the pathfinding decision-making algorithm, I don't have to wait. There's no waiting for that, right? But a lot of times, most actions take some time to complete, So a general action manager, right, if we're going to create an action manager in this case, it will need to cope with actions that take time, and we can't simply complete the action in an instant. So we're going to have to queue up an action or schedule an action to be completed. And this scheduling, this idea of scheduling actions for an autonomous agent is very interesting, again, because it makes it so that the actions that they're taking are less jittery and more realistic. Okay. So again, we don't want to always one way of doing kind of setting up these things is setting up the same action every frame. So a good example is what we've done for you in the lab 7 so far. We've scheduled so that the patrol action is happening every frame. Okay, that's what's happening. And then what we want to do is that action can be interrupted. A good example of that is when we have a patrolling AI and they hit a spot where they have line of sight with the target. When they hit that spot in last week's lab, the agent would stop because their action has been interrupted, and that AI brain, the decision-making algorithm that we use, which is a decision tree, shunts to the appropriate action, which is stay at range, move to the player, fire a weapon, whatever that action is going to be. Okay. So that is something that a way of doing this. We have some kind of same state that's every round, and then we interrupt the action by means of kind of kicking in another decision. So here's an example of a state machine with a sleeping and on guard state. Okay, so 2 states, sleeping and on guard. When the character wakes up, it will need to carry out a wake up action, and probably involving some kind of animation and maybe some kind of movement. I'm waking up, right? Maybe I'm getting out of bed, whatever's happening, right? Similarly, when a character decides to take a nap, go to sleep, it will need a go to sleep action. And if we need to continually wake up or go to sleep every frame, when the state machine will require then 4 states. So I have a sleep and go to sleep action. And once I'm rested, that's the condition, it's going to shunt me or transition me from sleep to wake up state, right? And then maybe in the wake up state, I'm going to, when the wake up animation is complete, when that's done, I'm going to go to the on guard position. Maybe the on guard position is going to have a series of animations, like idle animations where or maybe some kind of scripted action that we'll talk about in a second, where the guard will pace. A scripted action is also something like a patrol. That could be something that happens that can be interrupted, right? So, and then if after a long while, if the guard gets tired or bored, maybe they're going to take a nap and go to sleep, right? So that's the next condition. And then you're going to have this cycle of transitions from one state to the other. Very, very simple game loop, if you will. Okay. But what happens, we only have 2 states. What happens if we have 5 states? That would involve 40 additional transition states. So it soon scales to be completely out of control, right? And, so we have to figure out that a way of doing that. If I have a bunch of different kinds of states and I also have some transitions, how do I set that up? We can support actions with some kind of duration, right? The wake up action will simply be requested on exiting the sleep state. So remember that idea of transitions in the state machine? If we're using a state machine design pattern, then we have a transition and it's going to call up X number of actions, like we talked about before. One of them is that, that wake up action, which is maybe the movement or the animation or whatever it is to get out of the sleep state, right? And the go to sleep state action will likewise be carried out when entering the sleep state. So now we have an entry and an exit for that particular state, going back to the whole state machine example, right? In this case, the state machine, we really don't need to have continuous processing. All we really need to do is, we're in a particular action, a state, and we're going to stay in that state. And then what's going to happen is when something changes, we're going to kick that state into the new one, and it's going to process the exit action from one state and the entry action into the other one. That's really what it's going to do. And that's why we do it that way, right? Because we haven't really talked about why. So after it signals that, let's say, for example, that it's waking up, we can wait until the character has played its waking animation before moving into the next action. A lot of times this is called blocking, right? And the reason why it's blocking is because this action is synchronous, okay? So I have to do one thing, and then I got to do the other thing. It's almost like a dependency chain. I got to do one thing until I'm done this thing. I can't do the next thing, right? And it can be good. It's reasonable, right? Because that's what we do as human beings, right? We can't go to the washroom directly from bed, right? Well, we could, but that would be very bad, right? We'd want to get up out of the bed, right, first. And then after we're out of bed, if we're talking sleep-wake states, we'd have to kind of stumble or walk over to the washroom and do your thing, right? That sequence of getting up out of bed is a dependency for you to do the thing which is to go to the washroom, as an example, right? So that one thing has to wait for the next thing to finish. And that synchronous set of actions is also called blocking actions. One thing has to block it. You can't do the next action until the first action is done. Okay. But actions take time, and they may start off being appropriate, right? But then they might be inappropriate later on. And a good example of that is, let's say an autonomous character sent off wandering to for a power-up, right? And it will really appear silly if it continues towards the power-up after a squad of enemy units springs, their ambush. It's time to stop going after the power-up and run away, because there's just, there's enemies around. So really what we want to think about is, if a decision-making system decides that an important action is needed, it should then be able to interrupt other actions currently being carried out. So similar to what we've done before. So again, if I have a enemy agent in our A4 that is wandering around patrolling for the player, and if the player shows up finally and it's in line of sight, then the enemy AI should be able to stop what they're doing, interrupt their patrol, and then be able to fire, or do some action, based on, their loadout against the player, right? So that they can be effective, right? They're not going to keep patrolling when the player's firing at them. That doesn't make any sense, right? So that even if they're doing a patrol animation, let's say there's a set of animations, worst case scenario, they should at least transition or blend from one type of action to another, right? And start doing that new action based on the action of higher importance, which is most time is defend yourself because you're going to get killed, kind of thing. So we've been talking about single actions so far, but what about compound actions, where again you might want to do a bunch of things at the same time? Okay, so simultaneous actions maybe more than anything else. So it's rare for an autonomous character to be doing only one thing at the same time. So there might be playing a gesture animation while moving around the level, while pursuing an enemy, while using a health pack. That might be something that they're doing all at the same time, right? So how do I layer all those things? And these layered actions, as an example, might be happening all at the same time. How do I get all these actions to be issued, as an example of something that I want to do? I want to play the animation, so that's the animation system, move around, some kind of locomotion, right? I'm kicking off the AI, I'm making an AI request, like we said before, to some kind of pathfinding algorithm, or maybe an AI request to some kind of behavior, a steering behavior. So I want to turn and face, or keep my distance, or any of those other kind of, steering behaviors we talked about in the first part of the semester, while pursuing an enemy. So I'm kind of tracking an enemy, keeping them in my line of sight, or using breadcrumbs, ways of tracking the enemy through their actual tracks. Maybe there's a system in your game, a mechanism, where if the player walks through an area, especially if it's on the sand or somewhere else, that the enemy can track them. Who knows, right? While using some kind of health pack, right? Which is, okay, so I'm damaged, and I maybe have another animation going on. I'm not just walking, I'm making a gesture because I'm kind of upset, but I'm also, as an enemy AI, because I just got hit, and I'm taking a health pack while I'm pursuing you, right? So that's very, very, layered and nuanced. It could be very, very complex if you want to make it that way. So again, the common implementation is really to split these actions up so they are generated by different decision-making processes. Okay, so we might use one simple decision-making algorithm to monitor health levels, so some kind of health monitoring system. We might use another decision-making algorithm to choose which enemy to pursue. I'm pursuing this enemy because they're the ones that, maybe I have a goal or a motivation, because they, burned the village that I come from, as an example. And I can also hand this off to a pathfinding routine to work out the best pursuit route, right? I want to kind of pursue in a specific line, makes the most sense. And in turn, this might use some other AI to work out how to follow the route. Maybe I don't want to go, I'm going to go along the wall because I want to keep, stealthy. So that I want the thing that I'm pursuing as an autonomous character to spot me, so I can get the drop on them, so I can get surprise. And maybe surprise has an advantage in game terms. Who knows, right? And some kind of other code to schedule the correct animations. Notice I say schedule, like the animations are going to play based on a certain time frame. Okay, So in this scenario, each decision-making system is outputting one action of a particular form, right? And the action manager needs to accumulate all of these actions, let's suppose in some kind of action queue, right? And then determine which ones can be layered together and which ones have to be done in a particular sequence. Okay? So that's one way of doing it. The other way, here's an alternative way, is to have decision-making algorithms that output compound actions themselves. So each, decision-making algorithm itself has compound actions. So example, in a strategy game, we may need to coordinate several actions in order to be successful. The decision-making system might decide to launch a small attack at a strong point in the enemy defense while making a full-strength flanking assault at the same time with different forces. All right, so two things happening at the same time. Both actions need to be carried out together, and it would be difficult to coordinate separate decision-making routines to get this done. So one routine kind of coordinates both actions. Almost like I have a supreme commander that's telling my troops to go flank while I'm attacking the strong point directly at the same time. And in these cases, the action return from the decision-making system will need to be made up of several atomic actions, smaller actions, or single actions, all of which are to be executed at the same time, parallel, as opposed to sequential, synchronized, blocking. One action has to finish before the other action starts, right? So lots of interesting, ways you can perform actions. One of the last things I want to talk about today is something called scripted actions, right? And when we think about scripted actions and what they mean, scripted AI is usually something that is pre-programmed, okay? So there might be a trigger to trigger that scripted AI, something that a set of actions or behaviors that I want that are going to show up. A good example is I enter a level, and as soon as I enter the level from the left side of the screen, if I'm playing a platformer, my 2D camera, zooms in on the princess that I need to save, or let's say the prince that I need to save, as an example, the hostage, whatever. And there's a small dialogue that comes up that basically says, from the captors, the enemy, that basically says, and now you're going to die, or something like that, right? And then it goes back to us. It's kind of, what it does is it enhances the conflict, and it raises the tension, right? So that way we know what to do. It's a different kind of action that we're going to take. It's still part of the AI because they're reacting to you. It's a reflexive kind of agent that's happening right now, right? Because it's a kind of cause and effect. You triggered the action, and I'm going to set up a sequence that's going to kick off based on what you just did, right? So here's an example. A scientist character may be placed in a room. When the player enters the room, the script starts running, right? And the character, the autonomous character, which is the scientist, rushes to a computer bank, starts a self-destruct sequence, and then runs for the door and escapes. That's a whole scripted sequence that has nothing to do with the player, right? That has to do with what they're going to do. That's what they've been programmed to do. Okay. So again, it can be used as part of the story. It can create story elements, and that's another kind of action that we can take as well, a scripted action. All right. So when we think about actions themselves, primitive actions, if we kind of do some more classification, primitive actions such as move to a point, play an animation, or shoot, those are primitive actions, can be combined into short scripts, right? And it can be treated as a single action. So I have a bunch of smaller actions that are scripted, and that scripted action is a sequence that I'm going to be playing, right? And especially if scripted actions, because they're very similar to compound actions, whereas a scripted action might be something that I run in sequence, a compound action I run in parallel. And if I can combine, right, the scripted sequence to have compound actions inside of it, a good example of that is the scientist who goes in while they're pressing the button, part of the scripted sequence is you see while they're doing that, the camera moves to the window, and in the window you see, you hear the alarms being raised. It's going to, that's it. The self-destruct sequence has been initiated. That animation that might be happening in the window where your camera is focusing on now, just temporarily, is part of the scripted sequence. And there's something else going on outside of your room that is actually happening that you have no control over. It's a set of think about something has been, a set of dominoes has been tripped, and they're going to go from one action to the other without your input. It has nothing to do with you, right? And then from that, the camera goes right back to the, to the scientist that trips the switch, for the, and it maybe some kind of UI is going to show you something like, 10, 9, 8. You have like 8 seconds to get out of the room or get out of the building before the place explodes or starts to explode. Who knows what it is? So it can be very complex, and it becomes a powerful mechanism for storytelling and for to create very interesting AI characters. Okay, so scripted actions. So let's put it all together, finally, after all this kind of stuff, right? So we have some kind of alarm mechanism, which is updated every frame and can schedule emergency actions if needed. So I have some kind of alarm mechanism, right? I have some kind of action queue, okay, where I can queue up actions to be played in a sequence or parallel. It's up to me how I want to do that, right? And there's some kind of single decision-making system, which is called whenever the action queue is empty, right? And when a valid action is in the queue, it is sent to be executed. I want to execute that action if it's a valid action. And the execution may be performed by sending requests to the game state, the animation controller, the movement AI, or something else. Okay, that's the idea behind it. And the picture might look something like this. We have an action manager, and the action manager is called once per frame, right? And again, what we can do is we can process an alarm mechanism to the alarm system. The alarm system schedules an action to be performed, some kind of interrupt. Typically what happens is in the action queue. And I might have some other actions in the action manager, like go to the next action, as an example. And while no action, but time is available, then, kind of loop or wait, if you will. Maybe we want to process some other kind of decision-making that I want to do. Maybe I want to schedule an action like, for example, an animation or something like that and put that into the queue, right? And the queue is going to trigger actions based on priority, as an example, and order that they got entered into the queue, right? So the action queue is kind of an interesting idea because it allows us to perform either one action or multiple actions at the same time. It's very interesting. All right, so that is kind of putting it all together. So we've talked about today, before we end for the day, because my talk is mostly done, we've talked about a couple things. We've talked about utility. How do I make the right decision, the best decision for the character? And I'm going to make the best decision for the character based on some kind of value that I'm going to assign based on their desires or motivations, right? So I'm going to make some kind of decision based on that utility, the best utility at the time, okay? That's what I'm going to do. And then when I make that action, what kind of action am I going to make? How am I going to make that action? Is it going to be a primitive action? Is it going to be a compound action? Is it going to be a scripted action? What action am I going to take? There's different kinds of actions that I can program. Questions around anything we've talked about today? So I wanted to mention a couple things here while you guys are thinking about what I've asked, right? And it's not a rhetorical question. I want you guys to ask some questions. Think about the stuff in the second half that we've been talking about. We've talked about decision-making structures, decision trees, state machines, behavior trees. We talked about those as well, right? We talked about goal-oriented behavior and utility theory. And next week, we're going to be talking about tactical and strategic AI. And the week after that, we're going to be talking about learning systems, Q learning, and that kind of thing, right? What we're trying to do is create a layering, right? Every single week, we kind of move on. We introduce new things for you to make a more realistic AI. And again, the whole goal of this whole course, if you think about it, is to provide two things to the player, right? And we're going to talk about this again. Challenge, right? Because if the player is challenged and they get into the zone, right, they become immersed in what they're doing. And if they become immersed in what they're doing, they're going to want to play your game. That's really why we're doing this whole thing in the first place, right? To create challenge for the player. If there's no challenge for the player, there's no game. There's no game if there's no challenge, okay? And it's going to be, like we said before, as basic precepts, design considerations. Easy to learn how to play your game, harder to master. That idea of easy to learn, harder to master, which can also indicate things like my AI that I'm going to program as an AI designer is going to be more and more complex and more nuanced as the player gets into the game. Okay, that's what we want to offer for for most games, to make the most successful, the most the game that people want to play over and over again. a nuanced AI, an AI that's not going to be as predictable. It's not deterministic, okay, and all those kind of things. And that's why we're introducing all of these things here to also help you code, to think about, well, how do I make a decision? How do I know what the right decision is for a particular AI if it has goals? Utility theory might be a way of doing that. And then what is an action? All right, any questions around what we've talked about so far? Okay, let's talk about let's skip down to the lab then. So this week's lab, we're going to be talking about sprite sheets a little bit, focusing on that. Sprite sheets and how to use sprites and sprite sheets a little bit, because we've been asking you to do stuff with an A4 to do animations and those kind of things. We're going to talk about that and how to do that in the lab. I know Alex he's taking requests on how to do that. So I think he's gonna do that inside of our lab time together, which is kind of good. We're gonna also revisit very briefly obstacle avoidance, as well as the things that we want to take out to help you out with for A4 are move behind cover and wait behind cover. How do I do that? Because for a ranged combat enemy, move behind cover happens when I get hit, and as an example, I want to move to protect myself. Maybe they're in kind of implicitly, we haven't told you what the ranged combat enemy's desires are, but definitely to not get killed right away and to provide a challenge for the player to attack them might be an action, or might be some kind of desire that we want to take. And that's why we've included move behind action, move behind cover, and wait some random interval behind cover, because if I always wait exactly like 200 milliseconds behind cover, it's very predictable. You can predict the beat of when the enemy is going to pop their head out. If it's random, as an example, then it might make it more difficult for you to, kind of get a target on the enemy. And that's why we have these two actions. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on this week for the most part. I think Alex might add more, of course, to this one, and we'll see more from that in his notes. Any questions around A4 that I can answer before we move on? Because we still have quite a bit of time left before we stop for the day. So I can answer questions around A4 as well. You guys, no questions around assignment 4? You guys know what to do? All right, guys, I'm going to stop recording now. Oh, here's one. Not for A4, but how long after the last day of school our class be open before we get kicked out on Blackboard? Why are you asking that, Simon? Because you want to access materials, or why are you asking? I'm not sure, to be honest. You want to reorganize your notes. Yeah, no, you know what? I think the best thing for you to do is, if you're going to pull down things like PowerPoints and videos and all those kind of things, yeah, I would assume that you still have access for another couple weeks, before the next semester. I think after next semester kicks in, you don't have a lot of time after next semester where they shut, kind of Blackboard down. I don't think they keep it open forever. They used to. You could access older courses for forever, but I don't think anymore. I think they kind of remove you after a time. But I can ask Alex if you want. I'm going to shut down the recording now, and if anyone has any questions locally, then I'll take those questions now. All right, so any questions?